Music.
Music?
Music.
Music, yes. Anything else that we have missed that immediately jumps to your mind when somebody says Africa? Economics, so we can put that in the emerging markets. Okay. Art. Okay. Do we see any emerging trends, issues here? Actually, I don't think you are a very good representation of the United States from my perspective. Because what you have just presented me here with is a very nuanced picture of Africa, which is what it is. It is a picture of Africa that includes both positive and negative. But unfortunately, I think when you're talking day-to-day portrayal of Africa as it's made out to by the general public, it is very negative and very stereotyped. So we're already ahead of the curve, especially given the responsibilities that you have. I cannot tell you how many times, when I first came to this country in 1995, it was very, very frustrating for me in some regards. And it was the same to some extent when I lived in England for 10 years before I came here. The sort of questions I would be asked, which is the typical experience of many Africans when they first get here. I would get the usual, you speak very good English. Well, so do you. You know, I'd get the typical, do you speak Swahili? No, I don't. I would get the typical, do you live in houses? Yes, I do. And many Africans do. So this is a good start. But unfortunately, it's not the reality of the world, at least from my perspective. It's not the reality of the world as Africa is portrayed generally. And so we do have a lot of work to do there. Let us take a look at the recent Ebola outbreak in Africa. If you look at the media, you would have thought the entire continent was just rife with Ebola. And yet it was mainly 3 countries in West Africa that were impacted by this Ebola crisis. But what did we get? We got business missions to East Africa being canceled because people did not want to go to Africa because of the Ebola crisis. We had a teacher in Kentucky resign. She had been on mission work in Kenya. And when she came back, the parents at the school where she was teaching asked that she be quarantined for 21 days. This is Kenya all the way down here. Nothing to do with Ebola. We had the 2 Rwandan kids in New Jersey who were also put out of school. It's this sort of generalization that we're up against. It is this sort of conflation of Africa into one big mass where there's no differentiation, no nuance that we have to deal with. And I think one of the questions I'm going to have for you as teachers is, how do you grow the next generation of US citizens who are much more engaged, much more knowledgeable about the rest of the world? I think that's part of the discussion I'd like to have with you. I don't have all the answers, but I know some of the damage that can come from not having that knowledge about other regions and other countries. Somebody mentioned size, Africa's size. Look at that. Geographically, China, Europe, the United States can all fit into Africa with room to spare. That's how big this continent is. Africa is 3 times the size of the United States, again with room to spare. Think about how large this country is. When my husband and I got married, we drove from Wisconsin to New Mexico. And I was just absolutely amazed at the vastness of this country. It took us, I think, 3 days to get there. And the diversity as we went, to me, was mind-boggling as we went from one state to another. Drove across, and I'm so glad I got to do that. But it's 3 times the size of the United States. 54 countries. That's 54 countries, plus 2 disputed territories of Western Sahara and Somaliland. So this is why you hear sometimes people say there's 55 countries or 56 countries, but in terms of the recognized countries, it's 54 countries. So I think part of our job has to be getting students and the general American population to better understand the vastness of this continent, the diversity of this continent. Let me talk very quickly about some of that diversity. There's some who like to think that Africa did not exist until colonialism. Well, Africa has a long, long pre-colonial history. There's no doubt that the colonial period changed Africa in many ways, both positive and negative. But there was an Africa before colonialism. It is also a young continent in terms of the modern state. 1963 is considered to be the birth year for African independence. Think about that. Context is also important. Very, very young continent in that regard. I stand before you here today as somebody who was born in the colonial period. I do not care how good you are, you do not build a nation in 1 generation. Impossible. I have looked long and hard, other experiences in other countries, to see if anybody has actually been able to do that. So it is a challenge. There are many challenges in Africa, yes, but context also matters. Understanding how young this continent is important to how we portray the continent. If you look at the southern part of the continent, many of the southern African countries did not achieve their independence or majority rule until the 1990s. Namibia in 1990, South Africa in 1994. And you have a younger nation still in South Sudan, which became independent in 2011. So that context is important. It is not to excuse some of the things that some African leaders do, but it is important to understand that foundation of where these countries are coming from. Let's talk a little bit about the diversity of Africa, the languages, over 2,000 languages. The impact of colonialism, you now have English, French, Portuguese, Arabic, Spanish as the main official languages, but thousands more languages to go with that. South Africa alone has 11 official languages. And when you narrow it down still, let me give an example of my own country of birth, Zambia. 13 million people. English is official language, which would explain why I speak good English. So if you knew that Zambia was a former British colony and how language has played out in the post-independence era, that would not have been a question. But then there's 73 other languages in the country. I often say to my American friends when they're going on about Spanish this and Spanish that, I was like, it's 2 major languages in this country. Imagine an African country that's trying to build a nation with 73 different languages. Bring all of these people together. Create this national vision and work with that. Zambia is majority black, but they're also citizens of Asian and European descent. I like to remind people, Africans come in all colors. It's not an easy thing for some to accept, including some Africans, but Africans do come in all colors. The president of Zambia, 2 weeks ago, the president in Zambia died. Zambia now has a white president, the first on the continent, even though there are only 40,000 white citizens in Zambia. So as my Zambian friends like to jokingly refer to him as Zambia's Obama. But this is to make a larger point. That sometimes all you hear about Africa is the ethnic rivalries. But there's also an underpinning, an undercurrent of inclusiveness that's going on the African continent, in many, many countries. Some countries are still struggling with the management of that diversity, but it's not all African countries that are struggling with it. I come from a family of 11 kids. None of us is married to somebody from the same ethnic group. Not one. When the family gets together, it's like a mini United Nations. I would like to say that this is unique to my family, but it's not. It's understanding how Africa is transforming. These are some of those dynamics that we need to better understand. And yet sometimes as I read textbooks, even at the university level, there's what I would consider lazy scholarship, when everything is reduced to ethnic conflicts in Africa. It is not. You better get to understanding how Africa is transforming. So we need to do a better job of that. Why does any of this, why should Africa matter to us? I think in some ways Africa's contributions have been underestimated and have gone unacknowledged. And I think all of us suffer as a result of that. For me, I feel that unless we begin to account for some of those contributions, we're going to continue to struggle with Africa's place in the world. We're going to continue to struggle with how we engage with Africa. We're going to continue to struggle with race relations in this country. And I know we've come a long, long way. Long, long way. But all of that is tied into how we view each other, how we interact with one another, both at the individual level, but also at the country level. And this is why, for me, it's so important that we get a much better understanding of those contributions. Those contributions include mathematics. I think there were a couple of people in here who talked about mathematics. 20,000 years ago, the Ishango bone, the first attestation of math in the world, shows tallies that were made on a bone that was discovered between what is current day Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So this shows that somewhere on the continent at that time, people were already counting. People were already doing mathematics. How has that informed the world? You take music. We talked about music earlier on. Somebody mentioned teaching arts and music. The blues, informed by African rhythm, melodies, harmony. Jazz as well. So we really, and these are just two things that I could look I wanted to mention. But let's look at current day US-Africa ties and linkages. Those are important too. We all know about slavery, everybody talks about it, everybody touches on it. Today, 12% of the US population is of African descent. 12%. This country, from slavery to today, has been informed by Africa. Africa is a part of the fabric of this country. So it's understanding those interconnections. The African-born population in the United States has grown from approximately 800,000 in 2000 to 1.6 million in 2010. These are the latest census figures that came out. Of a study that was done by, Matthew, where are you? Census Bureau? Yes, thank you. Came out about 2 weeks ago. It's still very small compared to other regions. But what it tells me is that Africa will continue to interact and be a part of this country. We need to do a better job of understanding it. This always takes some people by surprise. But the United States imported roughly the same amount of oil from Africa as it did from the Middle East in 2012. Who would have thunk that? And if we're going to be so dependent on African oil, shouldn't we be so concerned to better understand that continent a little bit better? We know that the oil picture, the energy picture continues to evolve. There's production in this country that's ongoing. We're talking about the pipeline, Keystone, thank you, pipeline. We've seen the world oil prices go up and down, but the truth of the matter is that connection between Africa and the United States on this natural resources issue is going to remain for years to come. We also know that U.S. exports to Africa accounted for just over $22 billion in 2012, which is only about 2% of total U.S. exports, but it supported over 100,000 jobs in this country. That may look like a small thing, it may sound like a small thing. But if you think about it, as Africa transforms, as the United States seeks to engage with Africa on this trade in the economic area, those jobs could grow and probably will grow. And so better understanding the continent. And of course, I'm not trying to paint a glossy picture here about all the positive stuff that's going in Africa. We also have some concerns on the African continent. And that's important that we be cognizant of those concerns, particularly on the security side. I don't need to tell any of you about the 1998 embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya and Benghazi. So that also has to do with better understanding what's going on the continent, politically, economically, socially. How is Africa transforming? And here my issue simply is that we can choose to see Africa as this big blob of inconvenience that's over there, more trouble than positive, or we can acknowledge the transformation that's going on in Africa today and think about what does this mean for the United States? How do we prepare our students to better engage, or our citizens to better engage with that continent? Just some of the things, the ways in which Africa is transforming. Over the last decade, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. And as of this year, 7 of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. We've also had several African countries discover oil and other natural resources. Okay, I have issues with this middle class. I don't like the definition of middle class, but the fact of the matter is Africa has a growing middle class. I know sometimes it's difficult to see that amidst all the pictures of the poverty, the hunger, and whatnot that's used to portray Africa. But Africa does have a growing middle class. We have Africa inventions on the rise. I was reading recently an article by Forbes which looked at young inventors from around the world, and they had a list that included a number of Africans, including the inventor of the WAC, Africa's first Android tablet, which was invented in 2011, and also the founder of Medical Diagnostics, which develops and markets affordable and reliable medical test kits for malaria, pregnancy, and HIV/AIDS. Why do I raise this? First of all, it's the opportunity that these presents. But for me, it also shows that Africans are taking care of their issues. And this is important. One of the things that I've found troubling over the years is that there's always a tendency to depict Africa as a place that must be saved. That Africans are not doing anything for themselves. The Ebola crisis is one of those issues. Everybody was slow to move on Ebola, including Africans. I'm not going to dispute that. But just last week, there was an article that somebody put out saying Africans had done nothing. They have not contributed even to the UN fund for fighting Ebola. Well, that's not true. Africa was slow, but countries like Nigeria contributed over $1 million to the fight against Ebola. One of the first countries to contribute. So this continued depiction of Africans as completely helpless, I think needs to be moderated with some of the key things that are happening on the continent. The areas in which Africans are actually doing things for themselves. And I was very critical of Africans in terms of their response to Ebola. It was late, they should have been the first responders, and I think there was too much of a tendency among some countries to wait for the international community to do something. That's valid criticism. What is not valid is to say Africans did nothing for themselves. It perpetuates this myth of Africans always waiting for others to take care of their business. And that to me is really troubling. Actually, this last one is funny. I was talking to somebody over the weekend that, I didn't know there were 29 African billionaires as of 2014. And the immediate response I got from this person was, how did they get their money? I was like, what do you mean, how did they get their money? You don't ask that of other countries and how the people got their money. Again, it goes back to that issue. I'm not saying there's no corruption. My friend here raised it. We'll talk about that. But, there are a lot of resources on the continent, and some of these billionaires are actually doing a lot of work on the continent to try and improve and develop the continent. Let me just give a snapshot of another area. This is one that's near and dear to my heart, so please forgive me if I go on about this one. I always hear this thing about African women being oppressed. Yeah, there are areas in which gender relations in Africa, like any other country, like in any other region, are troubled. Absolutely. There are areas in which improvements need to be made when it comes to gender relations. But there are also areas where Africa is actually taking the lead. Africa. 3 female presidents in Africa. Liberia, Malawi, and Central Africa. 10 female prime ministers and 12 female vice presidents. This is all in the post-independence era. 6 African countries that rank in the top 20 in terms of women's participation in parliament, which is the equivalent of our Congress. Rwanda leading the world at number 1 with 63.8% of Congress being made up of women. That is a real achievement. And in some days when I'm feeling particularly naughty, I would say maybe the US could learn something. Right now, we are ranked 85th in terms of women's participation in Congress. I'm sure that picture, those numbers will change come the 2015 Congress. I haven't really looked at how the figures play out. But I thought this was something that would be good to put out there. That yes, there are challenges when it comes to women in many African countries, but there are also areas of progress where in fact Africa leads the world. Let's look at women in the security sector, another area where Africa is taking the charge. 28% of South Africa's military is made up of women. Same number in Namibia. South Africa has now set itself the target of 40% women in the security sector. We're at 16% in this country. 46% of Namibia's peacekeepers are women, leading the world. 12 of the top 20 troop contributing countries to United Nations peacekeeping missions are African. And yet, if you talk to people, you'd think Africa was nothing but a consumer of security. But this shows 12 of the top 20 countries that contribute troops to peacekeeping missions in Africa. Africa is contributing to global peace and security. I'm sure there are more reasons why we should do a better job of teaching Africa, and I know it varies from school to school, class to class. From my perspective, and I'd love to hear your perspective, I think it's absolutely critical that we remember that we're educating not just for the US citizens, but global citizens. And sometimes that global is missing, or is not being emphasized enough. Teaching about other regions, including Africa, gives us a better sense of our interconnectedness. From my perspective of having worked with governments, it also gives us the chance for better policies, better relations, and more opportunities. And I think, I could be completely wrong, maybe I'm being very Pollyanna-ish about this, but understanding other cultures makes for a safer and more peaceful world. But it also enables the United States to better compete. Right now, the United States is behind China and the European Union when it comes to engagement, economic engagement with Africa. And I know there's sometimes, as a superpower, I think there's sometimes a tendency to be comfortable within that status without realizing and recognizing that the world is changing and that this is going to require different engagement with different countries. So our ability to compete relies heavily on our ability to better understand other regions and their cultures. There is no such thing as an African culture. It's different cultures and how you engage within those cultures. I missed out my tips in. Okay. So let me talk now about some tips and resources for teachers in terms of teaching Africa.